A black woman CEO faces racial prejudice from a flight attendant on her own private jet, leading to a shocking confrontation that exposes deep-seated bias and sparks transformative change across an entire industry. The pristine cabin of the luxury private jet gleamed under soft lighting, with cream leather seats and polished mahogany accents creating an atmosphere of refined elegance. Sarah Jenkins, a distinguished 35-year-old black woman, settled into her seat in the first-class section, her tailored navy business suit impeccable, and her briefcase containing documents that would reshape 3 companies by week's end. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations, her fingers dancing across her tablet as she reviewed quarterly projections. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Melissa Carter emerged from the galley, her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect chignon, her flight attendant uniform crisp and professional. At 28, she had worked these luxury charter flights for 3 years, serving wealthy passengers who flew between New York and Los Angeles on a whim. But when her eyes fell upon Sarah, something shifted in her expression, a tightening around her eyes, a subtle straightening of her posture that spoke of assumptions forming and judgments being made. "Excuse me, ma'am," Melissa said, her voice carrying a forced politeness that barely concealed her irritation. "I think there's been some confusion here. This is a private charter flight, not a commercial airline. I'm going to need to see your boarding pass and identification immediately." Her tone suggested she already believed she knew the answer, that this was merely a formality before ejecting an intruder. Sarah looked up from her tablet, her dark eyes meeting Melissa's with calm composure. "I'm sorry. What seems to be the problem?" she asked, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who had spent years in corporate environments, someone who understood that the first person to raise their voice often lost the argument before it began. Melissa stepped closer, her posture becoming more aggressive as her assumptions solidified into certainty. "Ma'am, this isn't some commercial flight where you can just show up with a ticket you bought online. This is a private aircraft chartered by very important people. I don't know how you got past security, but you cannot be here. The real passengers will be arriving any moment, and I need you off this plane right now." The words hung in the air like accusations, each syllable dripping with presumption and barely concealed prejudice. Sarah's eyebrows raised slightly, not in surprise, for she had encountered such attitudes countless times throughout her career, but in disappointment that it was happening again, here, in 2024, when she had hoped society had progressed further. "I assure you I belong here," Sarah replied, reaching into her leather briefcase with deliberate calm. She withdrew a portfolio containing her identification and travel documents, extending them toward Melissa with steady hands. "Perhaps you should check the passenger manifest more carefully before making assumptions about who belongs where." Melissa barely glanced at the documents before handing them back dismissively, her mind already made up. "Look, I don't care what fake documents you have. I've been working these flights for 3 years, and I know exactly who belongs here and who doesn't. You need to leave this aircraft immediately before I call security and have you arrested for trespassing." The commotion drew other crew members from the back of the cabin. James, a 40-something man with graying temples and 20 years of aviation experience, emerged first, followed by Patricia, a woman in her 50s whose kind eyes suggested she had seen enough of the world to recognize when something was wrong. Both sensed the tension crackling through the cabin air like electricity before a storm. "Is everything all right here?" James asked quietly, his experienced eye taking in the scene. The well-dressed black woman sitting calmly, the agitated flight attendant standing over her, the documents scattered on the small table between them. "This woman somehow got onto our flight," Melissa declared, pointing at Sarah as if she were an object rather than a person. "She's got fake documents and she's refusing to leave. I think she might be dangerous." The accusation was wild, unfounded, born purely from Melissa's prejudiced assumptions about who could and couldn't afford to charter private aircraft. Sarah stood up slowly, her movements graceful and controlled, despite the degrading situation. At 5'7", she commanded presence without effort, her bearing speaking of years spent in positions of authority, of boardrooms where her voice carried weight and her decisions shaped industries. "I understand there may be some confusion," she said, her voice remaining steady. "But I can assure you that I have every right to be here. If you'd like to contact the charter company to verify—" "Stop lying!" Melissa interrupted, her voice rising to a near shout that echoed through the cabin. "I know exactly what's happening here. You probably saw this plane on the tarmac and thought you could just walk on and pretend to belong with these kinds of people. Well, not on my watch. I'm not going to let you scam your way into first class." The tension in the cabin became suffocating. Patricia shifted uncomfortably, her years of experience telling her that something was terribly wrong with how this situation was unfolding. She had seen many passengers over the years, from tech moguls who dressed in jeans and sneakers to oil executives who wore $1,000 suits, and she knew that appearances could be deceiving in the world of private aviation. "Melissa," Patricia said hesitantly, "maybe we should double-check the flight manifest. Sometimes there are last-minute changes or—" "No!" Melissa whirled on her colleague with fury. "I know what I'm doing here. This woman is trespassing, and I'm not going to let her manipulate the situation with her sob story. She doesn't belong here, and everyone in this cabin knows it." Sarah took a deep breath, her composure remarkable in the face of such hostility. Throughout her career, from her days as a junior analyst to her current position as CEO of a multi-billion-dollar aviation company, she had faced prejudice in countless forms. But it never stopped stinging, never stopped being a reminder of how far society still had to go. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Sarah said, her voice carrying a note of steel beneath its calm surface, "to please check your passenger list. My name is Sarah Jenkins, and if you would simply—" "I don't care what your name is!" Melissa screamed, completely losing control. "You don't belong here!" In a moment that would change everything, Melissa raised her hand and struck Sarah across the face. The slap echoed through the cabin like a gunshot, the sound seeming to freeze time itself. James gasped audibly. Patricia covered her mouth in horror, and for a moment, the only sound was the quiet hum of the aircraft's systems. Sarah touched her cheek where the handprint was already beginning to redden, her eyes flashing with controlled anger. But rather than retaliate, rather than lower herself to Melissa's level, she spoke with quiet authority that somehow seemed more dangerous than any raised voice could have been. "That was a mistake," she said, her words measured and precise. "A very serious mistake that you're going to regret for a very long time." James immediately stepped between them, his face pale with shock and fear. "Melissa, what have you done?" he demanded, his voice shaking. In 20 years of aviation, he had never witnessed such an unprofessional, violent display from a crew member. Patricia rushed to Sarah's side, her motherly instincts overriding any confusion about the situation. "Ma'am, I am so incredibly sorry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This behavior is absolutely unacceptable. Please, let me get you some ice for your face. And we need to call the authorities immediately." Melissa stood frozen, her hand still stinging from the slap, suddenly realizing the enormity of what she had done. She had just assaulted a passenger, regardless of who that passenger was. Her career was over, and possibly her freedom as well. She was trespassing, Melissa said weakly, but the fire had gone out of her voice. "I was protecting our passengers." Sarah walked calmly to her briefcase and retrieved her phone, her movements deliberate and controlled. "James, isn't it?" she asked, her voice carrying an undertone that made the experienced flight attendant's blood run cold. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Would you please call your supervisor and ask them to come aboard immediately? And while you're at it, perhaps you should also check that passenger manifest." James hurried to the cabin phone, his hands shaking as he dialed the operations center. Patricia remained close to Sarah, still apologetic and concerned, while Melissa stood in the middle of the cabin like a statue, the reality of her situation beginning to dawn on her. "Ma'am, please, is there anything I can do?" Patricia asked. "Some water? Ice for your face? I cannot apologize enough for what just happened. In 30 years of flying, I have never seen anything like this." "Thank you, Patricia," Sarah replied graciously, her tone warm despite everything that had just occurred. "Your kindness and professionalism are appreciated, and they stand in stark contrast to what just happened here." James returned from making his call, his face now completely drained of color. He looked at Melissa with a mixture of horror and pity, like someone watching a car accident in slow motion. "Melissa," he said, his voice shaking, "I just spoke with our operations manager. He's on his way up here right now, and I checked the passenger manifest." He paused, swallowing hard. "This is Sarah Jenkins." "So?" Melissa replied, confusion evident in her voice. "I told you her name doesn't matter. She still doesn't belong." "No, Melissa," James interrupted, his voice rising with panic. "Sarah Jenkins. The Sarah Jenkins." A long pause settled over the cabin as the weight of his words slowly penetrated the tension. Patricia's eyes widened with dawning realization, her hand moving to cover her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. Melissa looked back and forth between her colleagues, still not understanding the magnitude of her error. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "Who is Sarah Jenkins?" Sarah spoke quietly, with understated authority, that filled the cabin more effectively than any shout could have. "I'm the CEO and majority shareholder of Jenkins Aviation Group. This aircraft that you're standing in, it belongs to me. Your company, Elite Charter Services, operates under contract for my fleet. In essence, Ms. Carter, you just assaulted your ultimate boss." The words hit Melissa like a physical blow. The color drained from her face as the full implications crashed over her like a tsunami. She had not only assaulted a passenger, she had assaulted the owner of the company that employed her company. She had destroyed not only her own career, but potentially the careers of everyone around her. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This can't be happening. You can't be. You don't look like—" She trailed off, realizing how her words sounded, how they revealed the depth of her prejudiced assumptions. The cabin door opened with a rush of outside air, and Robert Martinez, the operations manager, hurried aboard, accompanied by 2 airport security officers. His face was flushed with panic and embarrassment, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. "Ms. Jenkins," he said immediately upon seeing Sarah, his voice breathless with anxiety. "I came as soon as I heard about the situation. I cannot begin to express how mortified and sorry I am about this incident. This is completely unacceptable, and I assure you that immediate action will be taken." Robert turned to face Melissa, his expression a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Ms. Carter, what you've done here today is beyond inexcusable. You've just committed assault against the owner of this entire aviation fleet. Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand the magnitude of your actions?" Sarah raised a hand to calm the situation, her gesture commanding immediate attention from everyone in the cabin. "Robert, thank you for coming so quickly. I think we need to have a very serious conversation about training protocols, company, culture, and how situations like this can be prevented in the future." "Absolutely, Ms. Jenkins," Robert replied immediately. "Ms. Carter will be terminated immediately, of course. We'll also be conducting a full investigation into how this happened, how our screening and training processes failed so catastrophically." Melissa looked around the cabin desperately, seeking any kind of support or understanding, but finding only disappointed faces and horrified expressions. "Wait, please," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know. I was just trying to do my job. She didn't look like someone who could afford—" She stopped, realizing how her words sounded, how they revealed the racist assumptions that had driven her actions. Sarah looked directly at Melissa, her gaze steady and unflinching. "What exactly didn't I look like, Melissa? Please, finish your sentence. What about my appearance made you assume I didn't belong here?" Melissa opened and closed her mouth several times, unable to form words that wouldn't further incriminate her. "Did I not look like someone who could afford to charter a private jet?" Sarah continued. "Did I not look like someone who could own a billion-dollar company? What exactly about my appearance triggered your assumptions? Was it my skin color?" "Melissa?" The cabin fell silent except for the soft hum of the aircraft's environmental systems. Melissa looked around desperately for any escape from the situation she had created, but there was none. The truth hung in the air like an indictment. "Your assumptions were based on my race, weren't they?" Sarah said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You saw a black woman sitting in first class, and your first instinct was that I must be in the wrong place, that someone who looks like me couldn't possibly belong in a world of private jets and luxury travel." Melissa broke down completely, tears streaming down her face as the full weight of her actions and their motivations became clear. Yes," she whispered. "God help me. Yes. I made assumptions based on your race. I'm so sorry. I know that's not an excuse. I know it doesn't make anything better, but I'm sorry." Sarah nodded, appreciating the honesty. Even as she recognized it changed nothing about what had occurred. "Your honesty is noted, Melissa, but it doesn't change what happened here today. You assaulted me based on racial prejudice. That has consequences that go far beyond just losing your job. There are legal implications, criminal charges to consider." Robert stepped forward, his face grave. "Ms. Jenkins, we will cooperate fully with any legal action you choose to pursue. And effective immediately, we'll implement comprehensive diversity and bias training for all staff members. This will never happen again." "That's a start, Robert," Sarah replied. "But I want more than just training sessions. I want a complete review of your hiring practices, your company culture, and your complaint procedures. I want to know how many other incidents like this have occurred that didn't involve someone with the power to demand changes." James and Patricia exchanged uncomfortable glances, and Patricia spoke up quietly. "Ms. Jenkins, there have been other situations over the years. Complaints from passengers that were dismissed or not taken seriously by management." Sarah nodded grimly. "I thought there might be. This kind of behavior doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's usually part of a larger pattern of discrimination that gets overlooked or excused." Sarah moved to one of the large windows, gazing out at the tarmac where ground crews were preparing other aircraft for departure. The others waited in tense silence, understanding that her next words would determine not just Melissa's fate, but the future of their entire operation. "This incident isn't just about one flight attendant's prejudice," Sarah said, turning back to face them. "This is about a system that allows these attitudes to flourish unchecked. It's about a culture that fails to recognize and address bias. When it occurs..." Robert stepped forward eagerly. "What would you like us to do, Ms. Jenkins? Whatever changes you require, we'll implement them immediately." Sarah considered her words carefully. "First, Elite Charter Services will implement mandatory unconscious bias training for all employees within 30 days. Second, you'll establish an anonymous reporting system for discrimination complaints with a third-party company handling the investigations. Third, you'll diversify your hiring practices and leadership team, and I want to see concrete progress within 6 months." "Absolutely," Robert replied without hesitation. "Whatever you require, we'll make it happen." Sarah turned to Melissa, who stood with tears still streaming down her face. "As for you, Ms. Carter, you'll be terminated immediately, as Robert indicated. But more importantly, I hope you'll take this as an opportunity to examine your biases and grow as a person. What happened here today should be a wake-up call, not just an ending." Melissa nodded through her tears. I will, Ms. Jenkins, I promise I will. I'm so ashamed of what I did, of who I apparently am. I want to be better than this. Shame is a start, Sarah replied, but action is what truly matters. Use this experience to educate yourself, to understand how prejudice works and how to fight it. Volunteer with civil rights organizations, take classes, read books by Black authors. Don't let this moment define you. Let it transform you. The security officers escorted Melissa from the aircraft, her career in aviation over, her future uncertain. Robert remained behind with James and Patricia, all of them understanding that their industry had just been given a harsh but necessary lesson about equality and respect. Ms. Jenkins, Robert said, how can we begin to rebuild your trust in our company? How can we prove that this incident was an aberration and not representative of our values? Sarah settled back into her seat, her composure remarkable given everything that had just occurred. By proving it through your actions over the coming months, Robert. Show me that you're serious about change, not just damage control. I'll be watching, and I'll be evaluating your progress regularly. Patricia stepped forward hesitantly. Ma'am, I want you to know that not all of us share those attitudes. What happened today was wrong, and I'm glad it's finally being addressed properly. Sarah smiled for the first time since the incident began. Thank you, Patricia. Your professionalism throughout this entire situation has been noted and appreciated. People like you give me hope for the industry. James cleared his throat, nervously. Will you still be flying with us today, Ms. Jenkins? Sarah considered the question for a moment. Yes, I will. But this will be the last time I use elite charter services until I see concrete evidence of the changes we've discussed, and I'll be expecting detailed reports on your progress before I consider renewing our contract. You'll have our first report within the week, Robert promised as he prepared to leave the aircraft. As the aircraft prepared for departure, Sarah reflected on the incident while reviewing her notes. She pulled out her phone and began typing. A message to her assistant, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. Memo for Monday's board meeting, she dictated into her phone. Agenda Item 1. Company-wide bias training initiative for all Jenkins Aviation Group subsidiaries and contractors. Agenda Item 2. Establishment of Diversity and Inclusion Oversight Committee. Agenda Item 3. Review of all current service. Contracts with emphasis on equality standards. Patricia approached with a cup of coffee, her manner respectful but warm. Your coffee, Ms. Jenkins. And again, I want to apologize for what happened. It should never have occurred. Patricia, you handled yourself with grace and professionalism throughout this entire ordeal, Sarah replied. That speaks well of your character and your training. Thank you, ma'am. If I may ask, how do you handle situations like this? You remained so calm and composed when I think most people would have lost their temper completely. Sarah considered the question thoughtfully. I've faced prejudice my entire career, Patricia. Early on, I learned that responding with dignity and strength is more powerful than reacting with anger. But that doesn't mean I accept it or let it slide. There's a difference between maintaining composure and being passive. You're inspiring, Ms. Jenkins. I hope my daughter grows up to be as strong as you are. I'm just a person who refuses to be defined by others' limitations, Sarah replied. And I hope your daughter grows up in a world where she doesn't have to be as strong as I've had to be. 3 months later, Robert Martinez sat across from Sarah in the conference room of Elite Charter Services headquarters, charts and reports spread across the mahogany table between them. The walls were lined with photos of aircraft and satisfied customers, but the atmosphere was serious and focused. As you can see from these reports, Robert said, pointing to various graphs and statistics, we've implemented all the changes you requested and more. Discrimination complaints are down by 80%, employee satisfaction scores have increased significantly, and we've hired a much more diverse staff at all levels of the organization. Sarah reviewed the documents carefully, her trained eye picking out the key metrics and trends. These numbers are encouraging, Robert. What about cultural changes? Are people actually behaving differently, or are they just being more careful about getting caught? Both, honestly, Robert admitted. But the training has been eye-opening for many employees. We've had several people come forward to report incidents they witnessed in the past, and we've had frank discussions about unconscious bias that I think have genuinely changed perspectives. Sarah nodded approvingly. What about Melissa Carter? Have you heard anything about her? Robert reached into his briefcase and withdrew an envelope. She's been attending counseling sessions and volunteering with several civil rights organizations. She sent this letter for you, though she's not asking for anything. Just wanted you to know about the work she's doing. Sarah opened the envelope and read the handwritten letter carefully. It was several pages long, detailing Melissa's journey of self-discovery and education since the incident. She had enrolled in diversity training courses, begun volunteering at a community center in a predominantly Black neighborhood, and was working with a therapist to understand the roots of her prejudiced thinking. She's asking for nothing, Sarah observed after finishing the letter, just expressing genuine remorse and detailing the steps she's taking to educate herself and make amends. She seems truly changed by the experience, Robert noted. Several of the organizations she's volunteering with have contacted us to vouch for her commitment to learning and growing. Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. That was always the goal, Robert. Not to destroy her life, but to create an opportunity for growth and understanding. Punishment without the possibility of redemption serves no one. Robert leaned forward hopefully. Miss Jenkins, given the progress we've made and the changes we've implemented, would you consider resuming full service with elite charter services? Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the airport where several of her aircraft were being serviced. The afternoon sun glinted off their polished surfaces, and ground crews of diverse backgrounds worked together efficiently and professionally. I think Elite Charter Services has earned a second chance, she said, turning back to face Robert with a slight smile. But I'll be watching, and these changes need to be permanent, not just a response to crisis. They shook hands across the conference table as Sarah prepared to leave. Outside, the world of aviation continued its complex dance of arrivals and departures, but something fundamental had shifted. One incident of prejudice had sparked changes that would ripple through the industry for years to come, creating opportunities for understanding, growth, and genuine equality. The story of Sarah Jenkins and Melissa Carter became a case study in business schools and diversity training programs, an example of how individual acts of discrimination could be transformed into catalysts for systemic change. It demonstrated that true justice lay not in revenge, but in creating a world where such incidents became impossible, where assumptions based on race or appearance were challenged and overcome through education, understanding, and genuine human connection.